Jessica's hiking boots crunched against the damp forest floor as she and her two friends, Eric and Hannah, made their way deeper into the woods. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a chance to escape the city noise and enjoy the serenity of nature. But when they stumbled upon the old mansion, everything changed. The house stood like a ghost from another era, its once grand facade now cloaked in ivy and decay. Its tall windows, cracked and fogged, seemed to stare back at them. A rusted iron gate hung loosely, creaking as the wind pushed it. Eric was the first to speak. "Do you think anyone lives here?" "Not a chance," Jessica replied, stepping closer. "It's probably been abandoned for years." But something about the house called to her, a strange pull she couldn't explain. Against her better judgment, she pushed open the gate, its groan echoing through the silent woods. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of mildew and rot. Dust particles floated in the beams of light seeping through the broken windows. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath their feet as they ventured further inside. Jessica's flashlight illuminated faded wallpaper, cobweb-covered furniture, and a staircase that spiraled into darkness. "This place is creepy," Hannah muttered, clutching her jacket. "We should leave." "Come on. It's just an old house," Eric said, his tone teasing. "What's the worst that could happen?" As if in response, a faint whisper drifted through the air. "Did you hear that?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric laughed nervously. "Probably the wind," but it wasn't the wind. The whispers grew louder, circling them like unseen voices speaking just out of reach. Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. The whispers didn't sound like words. They were more like fragmented thoughts, murmured with an urgency that set her teeth on edge. In the living room, they found a fireplace filled with ashes. Above it hung a faded portrait of a stern-looking man and a woman with hollow eyes. Between them stood a little girl clutching a doll. "Who do you think they were?" Jessica asked, staring at the painting. "Probably the original owners," Hannah said, her voice trembling. As they turned to leave the room, Jessica spotted something on the floor, a dusty leather-bound book. She picked it up, brushing off the dirt to reveal a name embossed on the cover. Margaret Summers. "It's a diary," she said, opening it carefully. The pages were brittle, the ink faded but legible. The last entry was dated March 13th, 1927. "They told me not to listen, but I couldn't resist. The whispers are in my head now, and they won't stop. I fear I'll soon become one of them." Jessica's stomach turned. "We need to get out of here." Before anyone could respond, the front door slammed shut with a deafening thud. The whispers intensified, filling the room like a swarm of bees. Jessica dropped the diary, her flashlight shaking in her hands. "Who's there?" Eric shouted, spinning around. The temperature in the room plummeted. Frost crept up the windows, and their breath became visible in the air. Suddenly, Jessica's flashlight flickered, plunging them into near darkness. A guttural laugh echoed from upstairs, sending Hannah into a panic. "We have to leave now," she cried, running for the door. But no matter how hard she pulled, it wouldn't budge. Jessica grabbed her arm. "Stick together. We'll find another way out." They moved cautiously through the house, the whispers now mixed with distant footsteps. Every corner they turned seemed to lead them deeper into the labyrinthine halls. In one room, they found a shattered mirror. As Jessica passed it, she froze. Her reflection wasn't her own. The woman in the mirror wore a tattered dress and had eyes that seemed to weep black tears. She raised a hand to the glass as if to reach out. Jessica stumbled back, her heart racing. "Did you see that?" "See what?" Eric asked, his voice tight with fear. They eventually found themselves in the study. Books lined the shelves, and the faint smell of burning paper lingered in the air. In the center of the room stood a desk with a single candle burning brightly, despite the absence of anyone to light it. Hannah pointed to the walls. What is that?" Scrawled in black ink were the words, "Leave, before it's too late." But it was already too late. The whispers turned into screams, loud and piercing, forcing them to cover their ears. The candle's flame grew unnaturally tall, casting grotesque shadows that danced around them. Suddenly, Jessica felt something grab her arm. She turned to see a shadowy figure, tall, faceless, and radiating malice. Its grip was ice cold, and she could feel her strength draining away. "Run!" she screamed, pushing Eric and Hannah toward the door. They bolted, stumbling through the dark halls. The house seemed alive, its walls narrowing and shifting to trap them. The front door came into view, but as they reached it, Jessica realized she was alone. She turned back, calling out for her friends. "Eric! Hannah!" No response. The house was silent again, save for the faint whispers that never truly left. Jessica burst through the door and into the forest, not stopping until she reached the main road. She collapsed, gasping for air, her mind racing with questions. She returned with police the next day, but the house was gone. In its place was an overgrown clearing, as if the mansion had never existed. To this day, Jessica refuses to enter another abandoned building. But sometimes, late at night, she swears she can still hear the whispers calling her name. Tom adjusted the volume on his favorite podcast as he drove through the quiet streets of Mapletown. It was another uneventful evening as a delivery driver for a local courier service, and his route was almost done, just one more package to deliver. He glanced at the delivery app on his phone. The address stood out immediately, 12 Maple Street. Tom furrowed his brow. He'd lived in this town all his life and knew that house well. It had been abandoned for over a decade, ever since a fire gutted the interior and claimed the lives of its last occupants. Tom considered skipping the delivery, but the note on the order intrigued him. "Leave the package in the red room. Do not knock. Do not enter any other room." Probably just some prank, he muttered, but curiosity got the better of him. The house was as eerie as he remembered. Its paint had long since peeled away, and its windows were either boarded up or shattered. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the rusted mailbox stood at an awkward angle. Tom parked his van at the curb and grabbed the small, unmarked package. He hesitated before stepping onto the creaky porch. The air felt heavier here, as if the house exuded a presence of its own. As he pushed the door open, it gave way with a long, mournful creak. Inside, the house was dark and cold, colder than it should have been for a summer evening. Tom turned on his flashlight, sweeping its beam across the entryway. Dust motes swirled in the air, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with something metallic. "The red room," he murmured, recalling the instructions. The house's layout was familiar. He'd explored it as a teenager on a dare. Back then, it was just an empty, spooky place with no real danger. Now it felt different. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards under his weight. Tom made his way down the hall, his flashlight illuminating peeling wallpaper and warped wooden floors. Then he saw it. A door at the end of the hall, its paint an unnaturally bright red, stark against the decayed surroundings. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but he forced himself forward. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The red room was empty, except for a single chair in the center. The walls were painted the same vivid crimson as the door, and the floor was covered in a fine layer of dust. The room smelled faintly of copper, and Tom's stomach churned at the realization. It smelled like blood. He placed the package on the chair and turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with such force that the entire house seemed to shake. Tom froze, his heart pounding. He pulled on the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and his breath fogged in the air. Then came the whispers, soft at first, like a faint breeze. They grew louder, overlapping until they became an unintelligible cacophony. Tom spun around, his flashlight flickering. In the corner of the room, a shadow began to form. It started as a formless mass, but slowly it took shape, tall and thin, with glowing red eyes that pierced through the darkness. "Who's there?" Tom shouted, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. As it moved, the whispers intensified, and Tom realized they were coming from the walls themselves. Panic set in. He banged on the door, shouting for help, but his voice was swallowed by the whispers. The figure was now just feet away. Its face was obscured, but its presence radiated malice. It raised a long, shadowy hand and pointed at the chair where the package sat. Tom didn't understand, but he didn't need to. He grabbed the package and flung it across the room. The figure stopped moving, its glowing eyes fixed on the object. Taking the opportunity, Tom turned back to the door and slammed his shoulder into it. The wood splintered, and he burst into the hallway, running as fast as his legs would carry him. The whispers followed him, growing louder and more distorted. He stumbled through the house, disoriented as the layout seemed to shift around him. Finally, he saw the front door and sprinted toward it. Just as he reached the threshold, he felt a cold, claw-like hand graze his shoulder. He leaped outside, tumbling down the porch steps and onto the overgrown lawn. When he looked back, the house was silent and still, the red door visible through the cracked windows. The whispers were gone, but their memory lingered in his mind, chilling him to the core. Tom didn't wait to see what would happen next. He jumped into his van and sped away, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. Later that night, he checked the delivery app to report the incident, but the order was gone. The address didn't exist in the system, and there was no record of him ever being assigned to 12 Maple Street. For weeks, Tom tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew the truth. Something or someone still inhabited that house, and it wasn't done with him. A month later, the house burned down in a mysterious fire. Locals claimed to see strange lights in the windows before the blaze consumed it entirely. But Tom didn't need to hear the stories. He already knew what was inside. The rain fell in steady sheets as Liam parked his car outside the dilapidated orphanage on the outskirts of town. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, staring at the looming structure through the rain-streaked windshield. The building was massive, with its once white facade now gray and weathered. Broken windows stared back like empty eyes, and the skeletal remains of a playground rusted in the overgrown yard. Liam was no stranger to creepy locations. As a seasoned paranormal investigator, he had explored everything from haunted hotels to abandoned asylums. But something about this place unsettled him. It wasn't just the stories, though those were disturbing enough. Locals claimed to hear children's laughter coming from the orphanage late at night, even though it had been abandoned for decades. Taking a deep breath, Liam grabbed his equipment. A flashlight, a voice recorder, and his trusty camera. He wasn't here to scare himself. He was here to document the truth. Inside, the orphanage smelled of damp wood and mildew. The floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, shattered glass, and the occasional stuffed animal, its fur matted with age. Liam's flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the peeling wallpaper and faded murals of happy children playing. The contrast between the cheerful imagery and the oppressive silence was unsettling. As he moved deeper into the building, his footsteps echoed in the empty halls, joined only by the occasional drip of water from a leaky ceiling. He stopped in what must have been the main hall. Rows of small, empty beds lined the walls, their metal frames bent and rusting. The atmosphere was thick, as though the air itself resisted his presence. Then he heard it, a soft giggle. Liam froze, his heart pounding. The sound had come from the far end of the hall. "Hello," he called, his voice echoing. There was no response, but the giggle came again, this time closer. It was faint and high-pitched, like the laugh of a small child. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and pressed forward, his camera recording every step. The giggles turned into whispers, unintelligible but insistent. They seemed to surround him, coming from every direction. Liam's breath quickened. He knew he should leave, but his curiosity pushed him forward. He followed the sounds to a room at the end of the hall. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing what had once been a playroom. Toys were scattered across the floor, blocks, dolls, a wooden train set. Dust covered everything, but the footprints of small, bare feet were clearly visible in the dust, leading to the center of the room. Liam raised his camera, capturing the scene. "If there's anyone here, can you make a sound?" he asked, his voice steady despite his fear. For a moment, there was silence. Then, one of the toy blocks slid across the floor, stopping inches from his boot. Liam's blood ran cold. He crouched to examine it, but as he did, the room filled with laughter, soft, playful, and utterly chilling. He spun around, his flashlight darting across the room, but there was no one there. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a low growl. Liam straightened up, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But before he could move, the temperature plummeted. Frost formed on the windows, and his breath became visible in the air. In the corner of the room, a shadow began to take shape. It was small at first, but it grew, twisting and contorting until it resembled a child. Its features were indistinct, but its hollow eyes and wide, unnatural grin were unmistakable. "Who are you?" Liam whispered, stepping back. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it took a step forward, then another. The toys on the floor began to move on their own, dragged by some unseen force. Dolls turned their heads to face him, their glassy eyes gleaming in the dim light. Liam backed out of the room, his camera still rolling. As he did, the whispers returned, louder and more frantic. They seemed to beg and taunt at the same time, urging him to stay even as they pushed him away. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing down the hall. But the whispers followed, joined by the sound of running feet, small, bare feet that shouldn't have been there. Liam reached the front door and yanked it open, stumbling out into the rain. He didn't stop running until he reached his car. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and finally managed to start the engine. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The orphanage stood silent and dark, but for a brief moment, he thought he saw the shadow of a child standing in one of the broken windows, watching him leave. Back home, Liam reviewed his footage. The laughter and whispers were clear, as was the moment the block moved on its own. But the shadow, it wasn't just in the room. As he played back the final moments of his escape, he froze. In the reflection of the rearview mirror, he saw it. A figure sitting in the back seat of his car, its hollow eyes staring directly at him. Liam hasn't returned to the orphanage since, and his investigations have all but ceased. He doesn't share his footage with anyone, and he never drives alone at night. But sometimes, when he's home alone, he hears it. The faint sound of children laughing just outside his door.